Welcome back to Nighttime History, dear listeners. Tonight we journey to a small medieval village where the scent of wood smoke mingles with fresh bread and the rhythm of daily life revolves around the ancient dance of growing, preparing, and sharing food. We are exploring what medieval people actually ate in their humble cottages and how they transformed simple ingredients into nourishing meals that sustained entire communities. Thank you for joining us on this quiet evening exploration. Settle back into your pillows, let your breathing slow, and allow us to transport you to a world where every meal was earned through careful planning and hard work. The first pale light of dawn creeps through the gaps in wooden shutters, and you find yourself stirring on a straw mattress in a one-room cottage. The air is cool and carries the earthy scent of the dirt floor beneath your feet. Around you, a family of 6 begins their daily routine, and the first priority is always the same: food. But not the elaborate breakfast you might imagine from movies about medieval times. Most people think medieval villagers started their day with hearty platters of meat and eggs, but actually, the morning meal was often nothing more than leftover bread soaked in watered-down ale. The wealthy might add a bit of cheese or honey, but for most families, breaking the fast meant eating whatever remained from the previous day's cooking. You watch as the woman of the house moves quietly to the dying embers of last night's fire. Her movements are practiced and efficient. She knows that rekindling this fire will determine whether her family eats warm food today or goes hungry. The precious embers have been carefully banked under ash all night, and now she coaxes them back to life with dry kindling and gentle breath. The cottage fills with the soft crackling of wood catching flame. Smoke curls upward toward a simple hole in the thatched roof, though much of it lingers in the room, stinging your eyes and coating everything with a thin layer of soot. This smoky atmosphere is so constant that medieval people barely notice it anymore. Their clothes, their hair, their very skin carries the permanent scent of wood smoke. As the fire grows stronger, the woman reaches for yesterday's bread. The loaf is dark and dense, made primarily from barley, with perhaps a small amount of wheat if the harvest was good. She breaks it into chunks and places them in a wooden bowl, then pours over them a mixture of ale and water. This soggy mixture, called sops, will be the family's first meal of the day. But bread is not just food in this medieval world. It represents survival itself. You can smell the distinct, slightly sour aroma of the sourdough starter that lives in a covered clay pot near the hearth. This precious culture of wild yeast has been carefully maintained by generations of women, passed down from mother to daughter like a sacred trust. Without it, there would be no leavened bread, and without bread, there would be starvation. The grain that becomes this daily bread tells its own story of medieval life. Most people believe that medieval farmers grew wheat as their primary crop, but actually, barley, oats and rye were far more common in the diets of ordinary villagers. Wheat was a luxury crop, often reserved for the lord's table or sold at market to pay taxes and rent. You can hear the distant sound of the village mill wheel turning, powered by the stream that runs past the edge of the settlement. The miller, one of the most important people in the community, controls access to ground grain. Families must bring their harvested grain to him, and he keeps a portion as payment for his services. This system means that every loaf of bread represents not just the labour of growing and harvesting grain, but also the complex web of obligations that bind the medieval community together. The bread itself would surprise modern palates. Dark, coarse, and often gritty from stone particles ground off the millstones, it was far removed from today's fluffy white loaves. Yet this humble bread provided the foundation for survival. A typical villager consumed 2 to 3 pounds of bread daily, representing roughly 70% of their total caloric intake. As morning progresses, you notice the woman beginning preparations for the day's main cooking project. She moves to a large iron pot hanging over the fire and begins assembling ingredients for pottage, the ubiquitous stew that would sustain her family through another day. This is not the neat, organised cooking you might expect from modern kitchens, but a process of constant adjustment and making do with whatever ingredients are available. Pottage was the backbone of medieval nutrition, though most people today have never heard of it. This thick, porridge-like stew could be made from almost anything. Grains, vegetables, herbs, and occasionally small pieces of meat or fish were boiled together in water or thin broth until they formed a hearty, filling mixture. The consistency varied from thin and soupy to thick enough to eat with your hands. Into the pot goes a handful of oats, some barley, and dried peas that have been soaking overnight. The woman adds water from a wooden bucket drawn earlier from the village well. This water is not always clean by modern standards, but it is the only option available. The constant boiling required for pottage actually helps make it safer to drink than raw water, though medieval people do not understand the science behind this protection. Let us stop here for a moment, dear listeners. If you are finding comfort in this gentle journey through medieval village life, we invite you to join our community of nighttime travellers by subscribing to Nighttime History and turning on notifications so you never miss our peaceful explorations of the past. A gentle like on this video helps support our channel and allows us to continue creating these quiet escapes for you. We would love to know in the comments where you are settling in to sleep tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. As the pottage begins to simmer, sending up clouds of steam that mingle with the ever-present wood smoke, you can observe the careful way the woman tends her cooking. She stirs occasionally with a long wooden spoon, worn smooth by years of use. The pot must not be allowed to burn on the bottom, yet the fire cannot be too hot, or the contents will cook unevenly. The ingredients she adds tell the story of the seasons and the family's place in the social hierarchy. In spring, fresh herbs begin to appear in the pot. Nettles, which grow wild everywhere, provide essential nutrients after the lean months of winter. Wild garlic, sorrel and dandelion greens are gathered from fields and forest edges. These plants, dismissed as weeds by many modern people, were precious sources of vitamins and minerals for medieval villagers. Summer brings a greater variety of vegetables, though not the ones you might expect. Tomatoes, potatoes and corn have not yet arrived from the Americas. Instead, you would see cabbage, onions, leeks and turnips making their way into the pot. Peas and beans, both fresh and dried, provide crucial protein. Herbs like parsley, sage and thyme grow in small gardens near cottage doors, carefully tended and fiercely protected from wandering animals. The medieval villagers' relationship with food was fundamentally different from our modern experience. Every ingredient represented hours of labour, careful planning, and often significant risk. You watch the woman's weathered hands as she chops a precious onion, saved from last year's harvest. She uses every part, including the papery outer layers, which will add flavour to the broth, even if they are later strained out. Preservation of food occupied much of a medieval household's energy during the abundant months. You can see evidence of this industry all around the cottage. Strings of dried herbs hang from the rafters, filling the air with their concentrated fragrance. Clay pots filled with vegetables pickled in vinegar line rough wooden shelves. In a cool corner, rounds of cheese age slowly, developing the strong flavors that will provide protein through the winter months. Salt, that precious white mineral, sits carefully measured in a small wooden box. It is far too valuable to use freely, yet essential for preserving meat and fish. Most villagers see salt only in small quantities, purchased at great expense from travelling merchants or produced laboriously from seawater in coastal regions. The phrase, "worth his salt," carries real meaning here, where salt represents significant wealth. As the day warms and the pottage continues its slow cooking, the sounds of village life filter through the cottage walls. You can hear children's voices as they help with various food-related tasks. Young ones gather eggs from chickens that roam freely around the village, picking insects and seeds from the dirt paths. Older children tend small vegetable gardens, pull weeds, and chase birds away from ripening crops. The rhythm of medieval eating followed patterns that would feel strange to modern people. The main meal of the day typically occurred around midday, when the morning's work was complete and energy was needed for afternoon tasks. This dinner, as it was called, centered around the pottage that had been cooking all morning, accompanied by bread and perhaps ale or weak beer. Most people think medieval villagers ate meat regularly, but actually, meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions or wealthy households. A typical village family might taste meat only a few times per year, usually during harvest festivals or when an animal died unexpectedly. Instead, protein came from peas, beans, eggs when available, and occasional fish caught in local streams. The cottage fills with the rich aroma of the slowly cooking stew, now thick and hearty after hours of gentle simmering. Soon, the family will gather around their simple wooden table, sharing this meal that represents not just sustenance, but the culmination of months of planning, growing, preserving, and preparing. Every spoonful connects them to the land, the seasons, and the endless cycle of survival that defines medieval village life. The wooden spoon scrapes gently against the bottom of the iron pot as the woman checks her pottage one final time. But your attention shifts to something far more fundamental to this medieval world. Beyond the cottage walls, the golden fields of grain stretch toward the horizon, and it is here that the true story of medieval survival begins. You step outside into the crisp morning air, and immediately the landscape tells you everything about the priorities of this community. Every available piece of land, from the gentlest slopes to the marshy areas near the stream, has been pressed into service growing grain. But the fields before you would look nothing like the neat, uniform crops of modern agriculture. Medieval fields grew in long, narrow strips, each one belonging to a different family in the village. You can see a man walking slowly behind his wooden plough, pulled by a single ox whose ribs show clearly beneath his hide. The furrows he creates are uneven and shallow compared to modern ploughing, but this simple tool and tired animal represent the family's most valuable possessions after their cottage itself. Most people imagine medieval farmers scattering seeds randomly across their fields, but actually they practiced a sophisticated three-field system that would impress modern agricultural scientists. You can observe this system in action as you survey the village lands. One field grows winter grains like wheat and rye, planted in autumn and harvested in summer. Another field holds spring crops including barley, oats and legumes. The third field lies fallow, resting and recovering its fertility through a full growing season. This rotation system, developed through centuries of careful observation, prevented soil exhaustion and maintained productivity year after year. The fallow field would be grazed by the village animals, whose manure would restore nutrients to the earth. Medieval farmers understood the connection between animal waste and plant growth, even without modern knowledge of nitrogen and phosphorus. The grain varieties growing in these fields would surprise you with their diversity. Forget the idea that medieval people grew only wheat. The most common grain was actually maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye planted together in the same field. This combination provided insurance against crop failure, since the two grains responded differently to weather conditions and disease. You can hear the distinctive sound of scythes cutting through grain stalks as harvest time approaches. The rhythm is hypnotic, a steady swish, swish that has remained unchanged for centuries. But harvesting grain was backbreaking work that required the entire community. Families helped each other bring in their crops, knowing that a few days' delay could mean the difference between plenty and starvation. The harvested grain tells its own story of medieval nutrition. A handful of freshly cut barley reveals kernels that are smaller and darker than modern varieties. These ancient grains contain higher levels of protein and fibre, but lower yields per acre. A medieval farmer might harvest only 8 bushels per acre in a good year, compared to modern yields of 60 bushels or more. Once cut, the grain faced its next challenge. Threshing, the process of separating grain from stalks, required enormous amounts of manual labour. You can see villagers using jointed wooden tools called flails to beat the harvested stalks spread across a hard dirt floor. The steady thump, thump, thump echoes across the village as families work to free every precious kernel from its housing. The winnowing that followed was an art form in itself. Women would pour the beaten grain from baskets held high above their heads, allowing the wind to carry away the lighter chaff, while the heavier grain fell to cloth spread on the ground. Their movements were graceful and practiced, developed through years of experience in reading wind patterns and adjusting their technique accordingly. But even perfectly cleaned grain was useless without the miller's intervention. The village mill, powered by the steady flow of water over its great wheel, represented both opportunity and oppression for medieval villagers. The massive grinding stones, each weighing several tons, could process grain that would take a family weeks to grind by hand. Most people think medieval millers were simple craftsmen, but actually they were among the most powerful people in rural society. The lord of the manor typically owned the mill, and villagers were legally required to use his facility rather than grinding grain themselves. This monopoly, called soka, meant that every family had to surrender a portion of their grain as payment for milling services. You can hear the deep rumble of the millstones as they turn, the upper stone rotating slowly against the stationary lower stone. The gap between these stones determined the fineness of the flour, and adjusting this gap required considerable skill. Too close, and the stones would produce flour mixed with dangerous stone fragments. Too far apart, and the grain would pass through only partially ground. The flour that emerged from these stones bore little resemblance to modern, refined flour. Medieval flour contained pieces of bran, germ, and often fragments of stone and other debris. This coarse flour was nutritionally superior to refined flour, containing vitamins, minerals, and fibre that would be stripped away by later milling techniques. The miller himself was often viewed with suspicion by villagers who suspected him of keeping more than his fair share of their grain. The phrase, "worth his salt," had a counterpart in "honest as a miller," which was understood to be a contradiction in terms. Millers developed a reputation for using false weights, adulterating flour with cheaper substances, and generally taking advantage of their monopoly position. Water-powered mills were marvels of medieval engineering, that would function reliably for centuries. The mill near this village has been grinding grain for over 200 years. Its wooden gears and iron fittings maintained by generations of millers who pass down their knowledge through apprenticeships lasting 7 years or more. The sound of rushing water over the wheel provides a constant backdrop to village life, as reassuring as a heartbeat. But milling was not just about mechanical process. The timing of when grain was ground could mean the difference between fresh bread and spoiled flour. Medieval people understood that flour began to deteriorate within days of grinding, developing rancid flavours as the oils in the grain went bad. Families typically brought only small amounts of grain to the mill at a time, enough for perhaps a week's worth of bread. The journey from grain to bread required one more crucial element that medieval people guarded as carefully as gold. Wild yeast, captured from the air and cultivated in carefully maintained starters, provided the living organisms that would transform dense flour and water into risen bread. These starters lived in covered pots near the hearth, fed daily with small amounts of flour and water to keep the yeast colonies healthy and active. Most people assume bread making was a simple process in medieval times, but actually it required sophisticated understanding of fermentation, temperature, and timing. The woman tending the starter in this cottage knows exactly how it should smell when healthy, what consistency indicates proper hydration, and how environmental changes affect the yeast's activity. This knowledge, passed down through generations of women, represented a form of biochemistry that would not be formally understood for centuries. The dough that resulted from mixing flour, water, salt when available, and active starter was unlike anything produced in modern kitchens. Dense and heavy, it required extensive kneading to develop enough structure to rise properly. You can watch the village baker, who serves several families, working the dough with strong, rhythmic motions that speak of decades of experience. Medieval ovens were community resources, too expensive and labour-intensive for individual families to maintain. The village oven, built of stone and clay, required hours of heating with wood fires before it reached the proper temperature for baking. The baker judged readiness by inserting his bare hand into the oven chamber and counting how long he could tolerate the heat. Bread was baked in batches, with families contributing wood for the fires and taking turns using the heated oven space. Each family's loaves were marked with distinctive patterns cut into the dough, allowing identification after baking. The aroma of fresh bread filled the entire village when baking day arrived, creating a sense of community prosperity that transcended individual circumstances. The finished loaves were dark, dense, and intensely flavoured compared to modern bread. A typical loaf weighed 4 to 6 pounds and was designed to last several days without spoiling. The crust was thick and hard, protecting the interior from contamination and moisture. Families would slice what they needed each day, often soaking stale bread in liquid to soften it for eating. Bread quality varied dramatically depending on social status and local conditions. The whitest bread, made from carefully sifted wheat flour, graced only the tables of the wealthy. Most villagers ate bread made from maslin, barley or oats, with colours ranging from brown to nearly black. In times of scarcity, bread might be extended with ground peas, acorns or even sawdust, creating loaves that were barely edible but provided essential calories. The importance of bread in medieval society extended far beyond simple nutrition. Bread served as currency in many transactions, with workers often paid partly in loaves rather than coins. The phrase bread and butter originally referred to the most basic necessities of life, while breaking bread together established bonds of friendship and mutual obligation that could last for years. Village life revolved around the seasonal rhythms of grain cultivation, and every person understood their role in this ancient cycle. Children learned to identify different grains by sight and smell, to judge ripeness in the field, and to perform the countless small tasks that ensured a successful harvest. This knowledge was survival itself, passed down through generations of families who had learned to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between feast and famine. As evening approaches and the last light fades from the grain fields, the enduring cycle of medieval agriculture continues. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new decisions about when to plant and when to harvest, new calculations about how much grain to save for seed and how much to grind for bread. In this world where bread truly is the staff of life, every grain of wheat carries the weight of survival itself. The scent of wood smoke and simmering grains draws you back toward the cottage as darkness settles over the village. Through the open doorway, you can see the iron pot hanging over glowing coals, its contents bubbling with quiet, rhythmic sounds that have provided comfort to countless generations. But this simple cooking vessel holds secrets that reveal the true sophistication of medieval food culture. You step closer to observe the careful dance taking place around the hearth. The woman tends her pot with movements that seem almost ritualistic, each stir timed precisely, each addition of ingredients measured by experience rather than written recipes. Her wooden spoon, carved from a single piece of ashwood, has been worn smooth by decades of use. The handle fits perfectly in her grip, shaped by countless hours of stirring pots just like this one. Most people imagine medieval cooking as crude and haphazard, but actually, the preparation of pottage required sophisticated understanding of cooking chemistry. The woman knows exactly when to add each ingredient to achieve the perfect texture and flavour. Grains that cook quickly are added later in the process, while tougher ingredients like dried peas have been soaking since yesterday, their hard shells softened by time and patient preparation. The pot itself represents a significant investment for this household. Forged from iron by the village blacksmith, it weighs nearly 30 pounds when empty and will last for generations if properly cared for. The thick walls distribute heat evenly, preventing the scorching that would ruin a day's worth of precious ingredients. A chain and hook system allows the pot to be raised or lowered over the fire, providing precise temperature control that would impress modern chefs. You can observe the layers of flavour being built as the cooking progresses. First came water, drawn fresh from the village well at dawn. To this base, handfuls of barley were added, their pearl-like grains slowly swelling as they absorb liquid and heat. The barley provides substance and a subtle, nutty flavour that forms the foundation of this meal. But pottage was never just grain and water. The woman reaches for a collection of clay pots arranged near the hearth, each containing different preserved ingredients that will transform this simple porridge into a nourishing feast. From one pot comes a handful of dried peas, their wrinkled surfaces hiding concentrated proteins that will help sustain the family through their day of hard labour. Medieval preservation techniques allowed families to enjoy varied flavours year-round, despite the limitations of their growing season. You can smell the sharp tang of fermented cabbage as she adds a spoonful to the pot. This sauerkraut, packed in salt and left to ferment in cool storage, provides essential vitamins during the long winter months when fresh vegetables are impossible to obtain. The timing of ingredient additions follows rules passed down through generations of women who understood food science centuries before it was formally studied. Dried herbs go in early, their tough leaves requiring extended cooking to release their flavours. Fresh herbs, when available, are added near the end of cooking to preserve their delicate oils and bright tastes. You watch her crumble dried sage between her palms, releasing its earthy aroma into the steamy air. This herb, grown in the small garden behind the cottage, was carefully harvested at the peak of summer and dried in the rafters above your head. Medieval cooks knew that herbs picked at the right time and properly preserved could provide both flavour and medicine throughout the year. Most people think medieval food was bland and under-seasoned, but actually, village cooks used complex combinations of herbs and seasonings to create deeply satisfying flavours. Wild garlic, gathered from forest clearings, adds a pungent bite that makes simple ingredients taste rich and complex. Fennel seeds saved from last year's plants contribute a subtle licorice note that complements the earthiness of barley and peas. The woman's technique for building flavour would impress trained chefs today. She creates what modern cooks call a base, starting with onions slowly cooked in the bottom of the pot until they become sweet and golden. This foundation provides depth and richness that elevates the entire dish above simple boiled grains. But onions were precious in medieval villages, and every part of the plant serves a purpose. The green tops, chopped fine, add colour and fresh flavour to the finished pottage. Even the papery outer skins are saved, bundled together to create a natural seasoning packet that can be removed before serving, but imparts subtle flavour during cooking. As the pottage continues to cook, you can observe the gradual transformation taking place in the pot. What began as separate ingredients slowly melts together into something greater than the sum of its parts. The starches from the grains thicken the liquid into a satisfying, substantial texture that will provide lasting energy for the family's work. The cooking process requires constant attention and adjustment. Too much heat and the bottom will scorch, creating bitter flavours that will ruin the entire pot. Too little heat and the grains will remain hard and indigestible. The woman adjusts the pot's height over the coals with practiced ease, reading the subtle signs that indicate when to raise it higher or lower, it closer to the heat. Medieval pottage was infinitely adaptable, changing with the seasons and the family's circumstances. In spring, fresh nettles would be gathered from the edges of fields, their young leaves providing essential nutrients after the lean winter months. You can see dried nettles hanging from the rafters, preserved for times when fresh greens are not available. Summer brought wild herbs that grew freely in meadows and forest clearings. Sorrel, with its lemony tang, could brighten the heaviest pottage. Wild garlic, more pungent than its cultivated cousin, grew in shaded woodland areas where families would gather it by the basketful. These foraged ingredients cost nothing but time and knowledge, yet they transformed simple porridge into flavorful, nutritious meals. The communal aspects of pottage preparation extended far beyond individual households. Neighbours would share ingredients when one family ran short, creating informal networks of mutual support that sustained the entire village through difficult times. A handful of dried peas from one household, some preserved cabbage from another, and wild herbs gathered by the children would combine to create meals that no single family could have managed alone. You can hear voices approaching the cottage as other village women arrive with their own contributions to tonight's meal. This sharing of food and cooking responsibilities was essential to medieval survival, though most people today imagine families eating in isolation. Actually, communal cooking and shared meals were common, especially during busy seasons when every pair of hands was needed in the fields. The first woman to arrive carries a small clay pot containing precious fat, saved from the autumn slaughter of the village pig. This rendered lard will add richness and calories to the pottage, transforming it from simple sustenance into something approaching luxury. Medieval people understood that fats were essential for health, especially during cold weather when bodies needed extra energy to maintain warmth. Another neighbour brings dried fish, preserved in salt and stored since the last time the village fishermen had success at the distant river. These small fish, bones and all, will dissolve into the pottage during extended cooking, providing both flavour and essential nutrients. Medieval people wasted nothing edible, understanding that survival depended on extracting every possible calorie from available ingredients. The social rituals surrounding pottage preparation were as important as the nutritional benefits. Women would gather around the fire, sharing news and gossip while tending their communal meal. Children would learn cooking techniques by observation, absorbing the subtle knowledge that would serve them throughout their lives. These informal gatherings strengthened community bonds and ensured that crucial survival skills passed from generation to generation. As more ingredients join the pot, the aroma becomes increasingly complex and appetizing. Wild mushrooms, dried and stored since autumn, add an earthy richness that makes the simple grain base taste almost meaty. These mushrooms, gathered from familiar spots in the surrounding forest, were carefully identified by women who had learned from their mothers which varieties were safe and which were deadly. The timing of the evening meal was determined not by clocks, which did not exist in medieval villages, but by the natural rhythms of work and hunger. As the sun sets and the day's labour comes to an end, families gather around their fires to share the pottage that has been cooking since morning. This timing allowed tough ingredients to become tender and flavours to meld into harmonious combinations. Most people assume medieval families ate in silence, but actually, mealtimes were social occasions filled with conversation, storytelling, and the sharing of community news. The warm glow of the fire and the satisfaction of a hot meal created an atmosphere of comfort and security that helped offset the hardships of daily survival. The serving of pottage followed its own customs and hierarchies. The father of the household would be served first, receiving the portions with the most meat or fat. Children and women would eat next, with servants or hired workers receiving whatever remained. But even these hierarchies reflected practical concerns about who needed the most calories for their labour, rather than simple domination. Wooden bowls, carved by local craftsmen from pieces of oak or ash, held each person's portion of the steaming pottage. These bowls, dark with age and seasoned by countless meals, were treasured possessions that would last for decades. Each family member had their own bowl, and the loss or breakage of one represented a genuine hardship. The thick consistency of properly made pottage meant it could be eaten with wooden spoons or simply picked up with pieces of bread. This practical approach to dining made sense in a world where metal utensils were expensive luxuries and cleanliness required enormous amounts of labour. Bread served as both food and eating implement, with the stale crusts soaking up every drop of nutritious broth. As the family settles around their simple wooden table to share this humble but nourishing meal, the bubbling pot continues to simmer over the dying coals. Tomorrow it will be replenished with fresh ingredients, beginning another cycle of careful preparation that has sustained this community through countless seasons of plenty and scarcity. In this world where every calorie matters and nothing edible is ever wasted, the art of pottage represents survival itself, transformed into something approaching comfort through skill, patience, and the enduring power of shared meals. The wooden spoons scrape softly against the bottom of the bowls as the last of the pottage disappears. But the story of this meal began long before the pot ever touched the fire. You can step outside into the cool evening air and still see evidence of the intricate web of cultivation, gathering, and preservation that made tonight's feast possible. Behind the cottage, barely visible in the fading light, lies a small plot of land no bigger than a modern bedroom. This garden, tended primarily by the women and children of the household, represents one of the most sophisticated agricultural systems ever developed. Every square foot serves a purpose, every plant carefully chosen for its ability to thrive in this specific soil and climate. The layout would surprise modern gardeners with its apparent chaos. Instead of neat rows, vegetables grow in seemingly random patches that actually follow complex companion planting principles developed over centuries of observation. Cabbages grow beside aromatic herbs that repel the insects that would otherwise devour the tender leaves. Beans climb up stalks of grain, their roots fixing nitrogen in the soil that feeds their climbing supports. Most people imagine medieval gardens growing the same vegetables we eat today, but actually, the crops filling these small plots would seem alien to modern eyes. Where you might expect tomatoes and potatoes, you find instead broad beans with their distinctive black spotted flowers, and turnips with leaves as valuable as their roots. These hardy vegetables could survive in poor soil and harsh weather conditions that would kill more delicate plants. Cabbages dominate much of the garden space, their broad leaves spreading in thick clusters that will provide food well into winter. But these are not the tight-headed cabbages of modern supermarkets. Medieval cabbages grew as loose collections of leaves, harvested a few at a time throughout the growing season. The outer leaves would be picked first, allowing the inner ones to continue growing and producing fresh food for months. You can observe the careful water management that makes this small garden possible. Shallow trenches direct precious rainwater toward thirsty plants, while raised beds ensure good drainage during wet periods. Every drop of water is precious in a world without irrigation systems, and the garden's layout reflects generations of knowledge about how to maximize moisture retention while preventing waterlogged roots. The herbs growing throughout the garden serve multiple purposes that would impress modern permaculture enthusiasts. Parsley, sage, and thyme provide flavoring for food, but they also act as natural pest deterrents and soil improvers. Medieval gardeners understood the concept of beneficial insects centuries before modern agriculture rediscovered it, planting flowers that attracted helpful predators to control harmful pests. As you move beyond the cultivated garden, the true richness of medieval food sources becomes apparent. The forest edge, just a short walk from the village, provides a bounty of wild foods that supplement the domestic harvest throughout the year. But this foraging was not random wandering in search of edible plants. Instead, it followed carefully mapped routes and seasonal calendars that maximize nutrition while minimizing risk. The woman from the cottage moves confidently along a worn path that leads to a clearing where wild garlic grows in thick patches. Her movements are purposeful and efficient, the result of decades of experience in reading the landscape for edible treasures. She knows exactly where each type of plant grows when it reaches peak flavor and nutrition, and how to harvest it sustainably for future seasons. Wild garlic, or ramps as they were sometimes called, provided essential nutrients and flavors that could not be obtained from domestic crops. The entire plant was edible, from the tender young leaves in early spring to the pungent bulbs that could be dried and stored for winter use. Medieval foragers understood that these wild alliums were more nutritious and flavorful than their cultivated cousins, containing higher concentrations of vitamins and minerals. Most people think medieval foraging was desperate scavenging for survival, but actually it was sophisticated botanical knowledge that rivaled modern ethnobotany. Village women could identify hundreds of edible plants, know their optimal harvest times, and understand which parts were safe to eat and which were poisonous. This knowledge was literally life and death information passed down through careful teaching and years of apprenticeship. The seasonal calendar of wild foods followed natural rhythms that determined much of village life. Early spring brought tender shoots and leaves that provided essential vitamins after the long winter. You can see evidence of this spring harvest in the dried nettles still hanging from the cottage rafters. These plants, gathered when young and tender, were blanched and dried to preserve their nutrients for times when fresh greens were unavailable. Nettles, despite their stinging reputation, were among the most valuable wild plants available to medieval foragers. Rich in iron, vitamins and protein, they could be cooked like spinach or dried and ground into powder for winter seasoning. The young leaves, picked before the plant flowered, provided crucial nutrition during the hungry gap between winter stores running low and summer crops becoming available. Summer foraging focused on different plants that reached their peak during the warmer months. Wild strawberries, much smaller but more intensely flavoured than modern varieties, grew in forest clearings and provided both fresh eating and preservation opportunities. These tiny berries were often dried whole, creating concentrated pockets of sweetness that could brighten winter meals months later. The berries that medieval people gathered would seem strange to modern fruit lovers. Elderberries, bitter when raw but delicious when cooked, grew on shrubs that also provided edible flowers for fritters and medicinal teas. Rosehips, the fruit of wild roses, were carefully harvested after the first frost had sweetened them, then dried and stored to provide vitamin C during the dark winter months. Medieval people had an intricate understanding of plant biology that allowed them to maximize nutrition while avoiding dangerous mistakes. They knew that elderberry stems and leaves were toxic, while the berries and flowers were safe and beneficial. They understood that acorns needed extensive processing to remove bitter tannins before they could be ground into flour for emergency bread. The processing of wild foods required specialized knowledge and equipment that made the cottage into a sophisticated food laboratory. You can see evidence of this processing everywhere, from the grinding stones used to prepare acorn flour to the wooden frames used for drying berries and herbs. Each tool was carefully crafted for specific tasks and maintained with the attention reserved for essential survival equipment. Mushroom gathering represented perhaps the most dangerous aspect of medieval foraging, requiring absolute certainty in plant identification. Village women who specialized in mushroom hunting were revered for their knowledge and feared for their power over life and death. They could distinguish dozens of edible varieties from their deadly cousins, often by subtle differences that would escape untrained eyes. The mushrooms that filled medieval diets included many varieties that modern people rarely encounter. Chicken of the woods, a bracket fungus that grows on oak trees, provided a meaty texture that could substitute for animal protein in pottage and stews. Puffballs, when young and white throughout, offered a mild flavour and satisfying substance that made them valuable additions to any meal. Preservation of foraged foods required techniques that were both art and science. Wild berries were dried on wooden racks in the sun, their natural sugars concentrating to create intensely flavoured morsels that could last through winter storage. Herbs were bundled and hung in dry, airy places where they would retain their potency for months of use. The timing of preservation activities followed natural cues that medieval people read as easily as calendars. When hazelnuts began falling in the forest, it was time to gather them before squirrels and birds claimed the entire crop. When elderberries turned deep purple, families would mobilize for intensive harvesting sessions that could yield enough berries for an entire year's supply. Vegetables from the home garden required different preservation strategies depending on their characteristics and intended use. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips could be stored in cool, dark cellars dug into the earth near the cottage. These underground storage areas maintained consistent temperatures that prevented freezing in winter and overheating in summer. Most people assume medieval preservation meant simply drying everything, but actually, village families employed sophisticated techniques that included fermentation, salt curing, and controlled spoilage. Cabbage was transformed into sauerkraut through careful layering with salt, creating an acidic environment that prevented harmful bacteria while encouraging beneficial fermentation. The fermentation process that created sauerkraut was closely monitored by women who understood the signs of proper development. The cabbage had to be submerged under its own juices to prevent mold growth, while the salt concentration needed to be precise enough to encourage fermentation without creating an inedible product. This process could take weeks to complete, requiring daily attention and adjustment. Onions and leeks were braided into long ropes that hung from cottage rafters, their bulbs gradually drying while remaining accessible for daily cooking needs. The braiding technique itself was an art form, creating storage systems that allowed air circulation while preventing individual bulbs from falling and rotting. These braided vegetables could last for months when properly prepared and stored. The small ale house at the village centre served as an informal exchange point where families could trade preserved foods and share preservation knowledge. A household with too many dried apples might trade some for another family's surplus of pickled vegetables, creating variety in winter diets that would otherwise become monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Salt, when available, transformed preservation possibilities, but remained expensive enough that its use was carefully calculated. Vegetables could be packed in salt to create long-lasting pickles, but the amount of salt required for effective preservation represented a significant portion of a family's annual income. Most families use salt sparingly, combining it with other preservation methods to stretch their supplies. The rhythm of seasonal food preparation created a year-long cycle of intense activity punctuated by periods of relative calm. Spring meant gathering and preserving wild greens and early herbs. Summer required constant attention to ripening vegetables and fruits. Autumn brought the urgent work of harvesting and processing the year's bounty before winter weather made outdoor work impossible. As winter settles over the village and the preserved foods from gardens and wild spaces sustain the community through the dark months, you can appreciate the sophisticated system that made survival possible. Every dried herb, every pickled vegetable, every carefully stored root represents not just food, but the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned to read the landscape, understand plant biology, and transform seasonal abundance into year-round security. This intricate dance between cultivation and wildness, between human knowledge and natural rhythms, created a food system that sustained communities for centuries while leaving barely a trace on the land that provided their sustenance. The preserved foods hanging from the cottage rafters tell only part of the story of medieval sustenance. As you step back outside into the crisp evening air, the sound of gentle bubbling draws your attention toward a low stone building at the village centre. The unmistakable aroma of fermenting grain drifts from its doorway, sweet and yeasty, promising warmth and comfort on this cool night. This is the village brewhouse, and the woman tending the fires within holds one of the most essential positions in the entire community. Her skills determine whether families will have safe, nourishing liquid to drink throughout the year, or whether they will face the constant threat of waterborne illness that plagued communities without proper brewing knowledge. Most people today imagine medieval brewing as a simple process of throwing grain and water together, but actually, the ale making that takes place in this humble building requires sophisticated understanding of chemistry, biology, and timing that would impress modern microbiologists. The brewster, as female brewers were called, has spent decades learning to read the subtle signs that indicate successful fermentation versus dangerous spoilage. You can observe her moving between several wooden vessels, each at a different stage of the brewing process. The largest vat contains malted barley that has been steeping in hot water for precisely the right amount of time to extract maximum sugars without releasing bitter compounds from the grain husks. Steam rises from the surface, carrying the sweet aroma of dissolved starches that will soon feed the invisible army of yeast organisms. The malting process itself began weeks ago when barley grains were soaked in water until they began to sprout, their stored starches converting into fermentable sugars. At exactly the right moment, the sprouting was stopped by gentle heat from fires carefully maintained at specific temperatures. This malted grain, now golden and sweet-smelling, contains the concentrated essence that will become nourishing ale. Medieval ale bore little resemblance to modern beer, lacking the hops that give contemporary beverages their bitter edge and preservative qualities. Instead, medieval brewers relied on combinations of herbs and spices called gruit to flavour and preserve their ale. You can see bundles of dried herbs hanging near the brewing vessels, each combination representing generations of experimentation and refinement. The herbs used in gruit varied by region and season, but common ingredients included sweet gale, yarrow and ground ivy. These plants provided not only flavour, but also natural preservatives that helped prevent spoilage and harmful bacterial growth. Medieval brewers understood that certain herbs could make ale safer to drink, even if they did not understand the scientific principles behind their effectiveness. Sweet gale, harvested from marshy areas near the village, added a resinous, slightly bitter flavour that balanced the sweetness of malted grain. This plant also contained natural compounds that inhibited the growth of harmful bacteria, making ale brewed with sweet gale safer for long-term storage. The brewster knows exactly when to add these herbs during the brewing process to achieve maximum flavour and preservation benefits. The brewing schedule followed lunar cycles and seasonal patterns that modern science has validated, but medieval people understood through careful observation. Ale brewed during the waning moon seemed to keep longer and taste better, a phenomenon now explained by atmospheric pressure changes that affect fermentation rates. The brewster plans her brewing sessions around these natural rhythms, timing each batch for optimal results. Most people assume everyone in medieval villages drank ale constantly because water was unsafe, but actually, the relationship between ale and water consumption was more complex. Clean water sources did exist in many villages, particularly from deep wells and flowing springs. However, Ale provided essential calories and nutrients that water alone could not supply, making it a crucial component of daily nutrition rather than simply a safe alternative to contaminated water. The nutritional value of medieval ale was substantial, providing B vitamins, calories and minerals that supplemented the limited medieval diet. A typical adult consumed between 2 and 4 pints of ale daily, but this ale was much weaker than modern beer, containing perhaps 3% alcohol compared to modern beers that often exceed 5%. This lower alcohol content made constant consumption practical without causing intoxication. Children drank ale as readily as adults, though they often received specially brewed small ale with even lower alcohol content. You can see the brewster preparing a separate batch intended for the youngest members of the community, using less malt and shorter fermentation times to create a mild, slightly sweet beverage that provided nutrition without strong alcoholic effects. The social aspects of ale consumption extended far beyond simple sustenance. The village ale house served as a community centre where news was shared, business conducted, and social bonds strengthened. You can hear voices and laughter drifting from the main room where villagers gather around rough wooden tables, sharing the day's gossip while sipping fresh ale from leather drinking vessels. Ale was often safer than water, not because all water was contaminated, but because the brewing process involved boiling, which killed harmful microorganisms. Medieval people did not understand germ theory, but they observed that people who drank freshly brewed ale suffered fewer stomach ailments than those who relied solely on water from questionable sources. This empirical knowledge saved countless lives over the centuries. The economics of brewing created opportunities for women that were rare in medieval society. Brewing required specialized knowledge and equipment, but it could be done in conjunction with other household duties, making it an ideal occupation for women with families to support. Successful brewsters could achieve considerable independence and influence within their communities. The quality of ale varied dramatically depending on ingredients, skill, and storage conditions. The brewster's reputation rested on her ability to produce consistently good ale that would not spoil quickly or cause illness. A batch of bad ale could ruin her standing in the community and threaten her livelihood, creating powerful incentives for maintaining high standards. You can observe the careful attention the brewster pays to cleanliness, scrubbing her wooden vessels with boiling water and salt before each use. Medieval brewers understood that contamination could ruin entire batches, even if they did not know the scientific explanation for why certain cleaning practices prevented spoilage. Their techniques, developed through trial and error over generations, effectively sanitized equipment and prevented most common brewing problems. The fermentation vessels themselves were works of art, crafted by skilled co-opers who understood exactly how wood grain, moisture content, and construction techniques affected the brewing process. These oak barrels could last for decades when properly maintained, their interiors gradually developing beneficial bacterial cultures that contributed to the ale's flavour and safety. Brewing followed seasonal patterns that took advantage of natural temperature variations and ingredient availability. Spring brewing used fresh water from melting snow and early herbs, creating light, refreshing ales perfect for the warming weather. Autumn brewing produced stronger, more robust ales designed to last through the winter months when fresh brewing was more difficult. The timing of each brewing step required precise attention to natural cues that medieval people read as easily as thermometers. The brewster could judge water temperature by the size and behavior of bubbles rising to the surface. She knew exactly how long to steep grain by the color changes in the liquid and the intensity of sweet aromas released during the process. Most people think medieval brewing was an all-day process, but actually, skilled brewsters could manage multiple batches simultaneously, starting new brews while monitoring older ones at various stages of fermentation. This efficient scheduling meant that fresh ale was always available, while older batches reached peak flavor and potency. The yeast that drove fermentation was not purchased but cultivated from wild organisms present in the air and on grain surfaces. Medieval brewers did not understand that yeast was a living organism, but they knew how to create conditions that encouraged the right kinds of fermentation while discouraging spoilage bacteria. Their empirical knowledge of fermentation science was remarkably accurate. The brewster maintained a mother culture similar to a sourdough starter that contained beneficial yeasts and bacteria essential for successful ale production. This culture was carefully fed with fresh wort and protected from contamination, representing a living library of microorganisms that had been selected over generations for their ability to produce good ale safely and consistently. Different types of ale required different fermentation approaches and ingredients. Small ale for daily consumption fermented quickly and was consumed within days of brewing. Strong ale intended for special occasions or winter storage underwent longer fermentation and careful aging that developed complex flavors and higher alcohol content. The serving of ale followed its own customs and social hierarchies. Fresh ale was offered to guests as a sign of hospitality, while older, stronger ales were reserved for celebrations and important occasions. The quality and age of ale served reflected the host's regard for their guests and their position within the community. Drinking vessels ranged from simple wooden bowls to elaborate leather jacks decorated with metal fittings. Each family owned their own drinking vessels, often passed down through generations and marked with distinctive patterns that identified their owners. The loss or damage of these vessels represented both practical inconvenience and symbolic loss of family heritage. The village alehouse operated under strict regulations that governed quality, pricing, and serving practices. The ale conner, an official appointed to test the quality of ale sold publicly, would visit regularly to ensure that ale met community standards. Poor quality ale could result in fines and loss of brewing privileges, creating powerful incentives for maintaining high standards. As the evening deepens and the last customers drift away from the alehouse, the brewster continues her work, monitoring fermentation vessels that will not be ready for days or weeks. Her knowledge spans the entire cycle, from grain selection to final serving, encompassing skills that sustained entire communities through the careful transformation of simple ingredients into liquid sustenance. In this world where clean, nutritious beverages meant the difference between health and disease, the village brewhouse represented far more than mere refreshment. It provided the foundation of daily survival, wrapped in the warm comfort of shared tradition and community gathering. The gentle bubbling of fermenting ale provides a constant soundtrack to village life, a reassuring rhythm that promises tomorrow's sustenance is already taking shape in wooden vessels tended by skilled hands. This ancient alchemy transforming grain and water into liquid nourishment continues the endless cycle of medieval survival that turns simple ingredients into the complex systems that sustained entire civilizations. The bubbling of fermenting ale fades to a gentle whisper as you step back into the cool night air, and the medieval village settles into the quiet rhythms of evening. Smoke from dying hearth fires drifts lazily from cottage chimneys, carrying with it the lingering aromas of the day's cooking bread, pottage, preserved vegetables, and the earthy scents of herbs dried in rafters above family tables. You can hear the soft sounds of daily routines winding down. Wooden bowls being wiped clean with rough cloth, clay pots being covered for the night, the gentle scraping of embers being banked to preserve precious fire until morning. These simple sounds tell the story of a food system so different from our modern world, yet so perfectly adapted to the rhythms of medieval life that it sustained countless generations. The cottage you first entered now glows with warm light from a single candle, its flame dancing across walls darkened by decades of cooking fires. The family inside moves through their evening preparations with the same careful efficiency that marked their entire day. Nothing is wasted, nothing forgotten. The woman sets aside a portion of tonight's pottage for tomorrow's breakfast, covers the sourdough starter that will leaven future bread, and arranges kindling so that morning's fire can be quickly rekindled. This attention to continuity, this careful bridging between today and tomorrow, captures the essence of medieval food culture. Every meal was connected to the last and the next. Every ingredient the result of months of planning and preparation. The bread they ate tonight began as grain planted last autumn, tended through winter's cold and spring's uncertainty, harvested with the entire community's labour, and ground at the village mill that served families for generations. The pottage that warmed their bellies represented an even more complex web of connections. Barley from their own strips in the village fields, dried peas saved from last year's harvest, wild herbs gathered from forest edges that their grandmothers had visited for the same purpose decades before. Preserved vegetables from the small garden behind their cottage, salt purchased at great expense from travelling merchants, and the knowledge passed down through generations of women who learned to transform simple ingredients into nourishing sustenance. You can appreciate now how every aspect of medieval village life revolved around this central challenge of feeding the community. The three-field agricultural system that maximised grain production while preserving soil fertility, the careful rotation of crops that balanced nutrition with practical growing requirements, the communal systems that ensured no family faced hunger alone, sharing ingredients and labour during the intense periods of harvest and preservation, the sophisticated preservation techniques that medieval families employed would impress modern food scientists. Fermentation that created sauerkraut rich in vitamins and probiotics, careful drying that concentrated flavours while preventing spoilage, salt curing that extended the useful life of precious ingredients through months of storage. These were not desperate survival measures, but refined techniques developed through centuries of experimentation and passed down through careful teaching. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval eating created a calendar marked not by manufactured holidays, but by natural abundance and scarcity. Spring's wild greens that provided essential nutrients after winter's limitations. Summer's intensive preservation work that captured the season's bounty for darker months. Autumn's harvest festivals that celebrated not just successful crops, but the community cooperation that made survival possible. Even the village brewhouse fits seamlessly into this interconnected system. The brewster's knowledge transformed grain that might otherwise spoil into liquid nutrition that could sustain families for weeks. Her ales provided not just safe drinking, but essential calories and vitamins that supplemented the limited medieval diet. The social gathering space she created strengthened community bonds that made sharing and cooperation possible during difficult times. The tools and techniques you observe tonight, wooden spoons worn smooth by decades of use, iron pots that would last for generations, grinding stones that could process grain for entire villages, represent a material culture perfectly adapted to its purposes. These were not primitive implements but sophisticated tools designed by people who understood exactly what they needed to survive and thrive in their environment. Most remarkable was the knowledge embedded in every aspect of this food system. The brewing techniques that created safe, nutritious ale without understanding microbiology. The preservation methods that prevented spoilage without knowing about bacteria. The agricultural practices that maintained soil health without formal education about nitrogen cycles and soil chemistry. This empirical knowledge, accumulated over generations and refined through careful observation, created systems that worked reliably year after year. The social structures surrounding medieval food also reveal sophisticated understanding of human nature and community needs. The sharing networks that ensured no family starved during poor harvests. The specialized roles that allowed individuals to develop expertise while contributing to community welfare. The regulations that maintained food quality and fair pricing in village markets. These were not accidents, but deliberate systems designed to balance individual needs with collective survival. As you reflect on the evening's observations, the differences between medieval and modern food systems become starkly apparent. Where we have global supply chains that can deliver tropical fruits in winter, medieval people had intimate knowledge of their local environment and what it could provide in each season. Where we have industrial preservation that can keep food edible for years, they had techniques that captured peak flavors while maintaining nutrition through months of storage. Where we have standardized recipes and precise measurements, they had adaptive cooking that responded to available ingredients and changing conditions. Where we have specialized grocery stores and restaurants, they had community networks that shared both ingredients and knowledge. Where we often eat alone, while distracted by screens, they gathered around fires to share meals that represented the day's collective labor. The medieval approach to food was not romantic or idyllic. It was often difficult, sometimes dangerous, and always demanding of constant attention and hard work. But it was also deeply sustainable, intensely local, and profoundly connected to natural rhythms that modern life has largely abandoned. Every ingredient was precious because people understood exactly how much labor was required to produce it. Every meal was valued because families knew how easily abundance could turn to scarcity. The knowledge systems that supported medieval food culture were remarkably sophisticated, even without formal education or written recipes. Women learned to read weather patterns that affected cooking times and preservation success. They developed botanical expertise that could identify hundreds of edible and medicinal plants. They mastered fermentation techniques that transformed raw ingredients into more nutritious and longer-lasting foods. This knowledge was precious precisely because it was essential for survival, and losing it could mean the difference between health and illness, abundance and hunger. The careful teaching that passed brewing techniques from brewster to apprentice, cooking skills from mother to daughter, and agricultural knowledge from father to son, created educational systems that were as rigorous as any formal schooling. The interconnectedness of medieval food systems extended beyond individual villages to regional and even international networks. Salt arrived from coastal areas or distant mines. Spices came from traders who travelled hundreds of miles. Iron for cooking pots was smelted from ore mined in distant hills. Yet these connections enhanced rather than replaced local food systems, adding variety and capability without creating dependence. As the medieval village settles into deeper quiet and the last cooking fires burn down to glowing embers, you can appreciate the profound achievement represented by this humble community. They created a food system that was simultaneously simple and sophisticated, local and connected, traditional and adaptive. They fed themselves well on ingredients that grew within walking distance of their homes, while maintaining the flexibility to incorporate new knowledge and respond to changing conditions. The lessons embedded in their daily routines, the importance of community cooperation, the value of traditional knowledge, the benefits of seasonal eating, the necessity of careful resource management, remain relevant today as we grapple with our own food system challenges. Their integration of agriculture, preservation and cooking into unified systems that supported entire communities offers models that modern societies might adapt for contemporary needs. The warmth emanating from cottage windows and the gentle sounds of families preparing for sleep remind you that food, at its most fundamental level, is about more than nutrition. It is about the daily rituals that create comfort and security. It is about the knowledge that connects generations. It is about the community cooperation that makes survival possible. It is about the careful attention to natural rhythms that keeps human life in balance with the environment that sustains it. In this medieval village where every grain of barley represents months of patient labour, every herb carries generations of accumulated wisdom, and every shared meal strengthens the bonds that hold the community together, you have witnessed food systems that were not just about eating, but about creating sustainable ways of life that could endure for centuries. Their legacy lives on not just in the techniques they developed, but in the principles they embodied. Principles of community, sustainability, knowledge, and deep respect for the land and seasons that made their survival possible. As the village sleeps and dreams of tomorrow's bread, tomorrow's pottage, and tomorrow's ale, the ancient cycle prepares to begin again, as it has for countless generations, as it will for generations yet to come. Thank you for joining us on this quiet journey through the food systems that sustained medieval village life. If you enjoyed our gentle exploration tonight and are still awake, we invite you to check out our other peaceful documentaries about daily life in ages past. And if you have drifted off to sleep somewhere during our time together, rest well and enjoy the rain.